The crowd gathered early, boots scuffing the dust that had settled overnight. The sun hadn't yet cleared the hills, but the square already felt scorched, dry, tense, expectant. A cart groaned past the well. A baby cried. No one looked up. At the far end of the square, a platform had been built from salvaged wood and old intentions. On it stood 5 women, silent, still, their wrists bound, their eyes lowered but not blind. They were not new to shame. One girl stood apart, not by choice but by posture, her chin held too high, her braid half undone. Her lip was cracked. Her dress, threadbare at the shoulders, clung too tight in the morning heat. The auctioneer's voice scratched through the dry air. "We'll start at 4. He didn't say her name. No one ever did. Just the price. The cruel man stepped forward before the crowd shifted. Broad shoulders, dust-colored hat, voice like vinegar soaked in heat. "She's not worth that. Ain't even housebroken." Laughter flickered low and nervous. Then his hand rose without warning. The slap cracked across the platform like a shot. Her head snapped sideways, but her feet didn't move. The crowd hushed, not out of conscience, but calculation. No one wanted to be the first to speak. She turned her face slowly, blood blooming at the corner of her mouth. She didn't cry. Not yet. Not in front of him. "See what I mean?" the man barked. "Mouth like that's not fit for a name, let alone a roof." He wiped his palm on his vest like it had touched something foul. "I'll take her back and teach her, if no one's got the coin or the stomach." From the edge of the square, someone watched. A man in a faded coat, hands scarred, beard uneven. Not old, not young. Just tired in a way that lived in the bones. He hadn't come for this. He needed flour, maybe nails. Something to keep the roof from giving way again. He had passed the auction before, always kept walking. But this time he didn't. The girl stood straighter now, blood drying in the heat. The cruel man turned, spitting near her boots. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Well then, 4 it is. Do I hear?" "I'll pay 5. The voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It cut the silence clean. All heads turned. Even the girl blinked. The widower stepped forward, slow and without ceremony. He didn't look at the cruel man, didn't look at the crowd either, only at her. "I said 5. He pulled the coin from his coat pocket and set it on the edge of the platform. The cruel man scoffed. "She'll eat you alive. Not worth your grief." Still, the widower didn't speak to him. He nodded once to the girl. "Come on." She didn't move at first. Then her hands twitched at her sides. Her jaw tightened, and she stepped down. No one offered help. No one stopped them. They walked past the stairs, past the whispers, past the cruel man, who stood with his fist clenched and his pride cracked wide open. The wind picked up just enough to lift the dust and the edges of the moment. By the time they reached the edge of town, not a word had passed between them. But something had shifted, not loud, not sharp, just real. The road out of town narrowed fast, as if even the land wanted to forget what had happened. Dry grass clung to the ditch edges, like old regrets, brittle and sun-bleached. They rode in silence, not because it was comfortable, but because anything spoken too early would have sounded false. The girl held her bundle tight against her chest, arms locked, shoulders square, like she was used to things being taken if she didn't. The man rode ahead, not far, not fast, just steady. His coat shifted with the wind, dust curling up around the mule's legs in soft ghosts. He didn't turn to check on her. She didn't expect him to. It took an hour to reach the place. Not far from town, but far enough that voices didn't carry, and nobody came knocking unless they meant something by it. The house sat low against the earth, its edges worn down by time and wind. The gate had no latch, and the porch leaned left like it had grown tired of standing straight. A single chair waited near the door, its paint long peeled away. He dismounted first, moving slow like a man with sore joints or maybe just caution. Then he looked to her, not as invitation, but as acknowledgement. She slid off the mule without help, landing heavier than she meant to, boots skidding a little in the dust. She caught herself before stumbling. He didn't offer his hand. She didn't expect it. At the door, he paused, opened it without sound, walked inside like he belonged there, but not like he ruled it. She followed, head high, eyes sharp. The inside smelled of cedar smoke that had long gone cold. The floor creaked under her weight, the kind of sound that lingered even after you stopped moving. He pointed toward the back of the house, said nothing. She didn't ask. The walls were plain, the table bare. A single mug rested beside the sink, still damp from the morning. There were no pictures, no signs of softness, just utility and space. She stayed near the door. He crossed to the stove and poured water from a kettle that hadn't seen fire in days. Set 2 cups down, one closer to her, but not close enough to feel like a test. She didn't touch it. He didn't watch. Instead, he stepped outside again, the door clicking once behind him, not slammed, but certain. She stood in the center of the room for a long time, like she was waiting for something to move. Nothing did. The quiet here was different than town. It wasn't watchful or cruel, just empty. The kind of empty that gave you space to decide what came next. When he came back, he carried 2 logs under his arm, set them down by the hearth, lit a match. The flame caught slow, climbing through the wood like it had to be convinced it was welcome. He didn't sit beside it, just nodded once and walked toward the far room. She moved only after he was gone. Sat near the fire, but not too close. Her back against the wall, her sack still in her lap, the cup untouched, the warmth not quite trusted, yet. Morning came pale and slow, a dull gray light spreading across the floorboards without asking. The girl hadn't moved much during the night. She dozed in fits, her body half curled near the fireplace, one boot still on, the other loosened but not removed. Her bundle lay against her side like a warning, not a possession. The man didn't speak when he came into the room. He set a pan on the stove, scraped together something from a tin, and cooked it without ceremony. The smell filled the room. Beans, maybe. Salt, if there was any. He left a plate on the table and filled her cup again, then stepped outside. She didn't eat right away. Hunger and trust didn't arrive at the same time. She watched the steam rise from the cup like it might spell something if she waited long enough. When she finally moved, it was only to bring the cup closer, both hands wrapped around it as if it were too heavy to hold otherwise. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls without rhythm. He was splitting wood again, not because he needed to, just because the swing of the axe made more sense than silence. His face stayed unreadable, his body steady, though his grip tightened when he missed a knot and the blade glanced off the stump. She stepped onto the porch sometime later, arms folded, eyes narrowed against the cold. The air a bit sharper here, clean but not kind. He didn't look up. She didn't speak. For a long while, that was all they had. He hit a rhythm. She counted it. By the 4th log, he paused, set the axe down, not with frustration, but something heavier. He walked to the well, drew up a bucket, drank straight from the dipper, then poured the rest over his hands like he could rinse the weight off. She spoke first. "You live alone?" He nodded once, then said, "For some time now." She looked past the fence to where the land dipped and rose like breath. "Not far enough to be forgotten. Far enough not to be reminded," he said. That was all. He went back to chopping. She went back inside. Later that day, she opened the back door without noise and stepped into the hills alone. Not to run, not quite, just to feel the space she was now inside of. The sky above her stretched without boundary, a hard pale blue, broken only by the scratch of crows and the lean of dry trees. She walked until her legs ached and kept walking because stillness made her feel like prey. She returned at dusk. No one asked where she'd been. He was sitting on the porch with a knife in one hand, whittling a long branch down to nothing. He didn't stop when she passed. She didn't expect him to. Inside, the fire still burned low. The plate had been cleared. The cup was clean. She set her bundle by the wall, folded it tight, sat down again in the same spot, back to the door, knees pulled to her chest. That night, the wind shifted. Not stronger, just different. She felt it before she heard the hooves. Far off, one, maybe two. Not close yet, but not aimless. She sat up, didn't speak, just stared at the door until her breathing calmed again. Outside, he'd gone still. Inside, she didn't lie down again. She stayed awake, just in case. In the dark, two people sat in two rooms divided by one wall, both listening for something they couldn't name, both pretending they weren't. The days passed in measured pieces. He woke before the sun, stepped outside, and didn't speak. She stayed inside, folding her blanket tighter each morning, but never leaving the space near the hearth. She hadn't touched the bed, hadn't asked who it belonged to, and he hadn't said. Each day he chopped wood, not because the pile was low, but because something in the swing quieted the rest of him. The thud of blade against stump filled the spaces where her thoughts tried to return. She swept the same part of the floor more than once, not to make it clean, but to feel the sound of the broom bristles scraping wood. Sometimes she cleaned what wasn't dirty. Sometimes she stood still for so long the light shifted across her face like time didn't know what to do with her. He noticed she never flinched when the wind hit the door just right, but she always tensed when boots crossed the porch, even his. She noticed his hands, calloused, careful, never raised. She noticed the way he opened cupboards like someone used to being alone, not clumsy, just slow, intentional, like he didn't want the house to forget it was his. One night she rose to use the basin, and when she turned her back to the firelight, he saw the thin lines across her shoulders, faded some, others newer, scars that didn't speak but still screamed. She moved like someone who had long since stopped wincing, because wincing wasted time. He didn't ask. She didn't hide. When she came back from the basin, she sat down with her knees to her chest again. He left a folded towel nearby. She didn't use it, but she didn't move it either. The next morning, he left a small tin of salve on the table. Didn't say what it was for, just went outside. She stared at it for a while, then slipped it into her sack without a word. That evening, he brought in a bundle of cloth, set it on the edge of the table. It was in the old trunk, might fit. She didn't touch it. He didn't push. The fire crackled low that night. The air felt like it was waiting for something. She leaned against the wall, knees bent, arms crossed. He sat in the chair with a book in his lap, though he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. "Why'd you do it?" she asked, voice quiet, not soft. He didn't lift his eyes. A slap? She nodded once. He set the book down, thumb still marking the place. Wasn't the slap. It was the silence after it. She waited. He didn't say more. Later, after he'd gone to the back room, she stood by the folded cloth, touched it once. The fabric was worn, soft in a way she didn't trust. She didn't unfold it, just left it where it was. Outside, the wind shifted again. Inside, she slept with her boots still on, but her head tilted against the wall instead of the door. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't keep a hand on the sack while she slept. The days blurred, but not in the way time fades when you're idle. Something small had started to settle in the house. Not comfort, not yet, but presence. Two people moving around each other without collision, breathing in the same air, leaving space where questions used to live. She began folding her blanket each morning instead of tossing it aside. He started setting a second cup without hesitation. The cloth he'd left on the table stayed untouched for days, then disappeared without mention. He saw it again one morning, soaking in the basin. She never wore it, not yet, but she hadn't thrown it out either. On the fifth morning, he hitched the mule and said he needed to ride into town. She stood in the doorway as he mounted, arms crossed against the early wind. "Won't be long," he said. She didn't reply. He nodded once, then rode off down the trail that carved through the dry hills like a thought he wasn't ready to speak. Town was no different. Same faces, same slow steps, but the glances lingered longer now. At the post, two men leaned closer when he passed. A woman shifted her basket from one hip to the other, not because it was heavy, but because looking busy made watching easier. He bought what he needed: flour, coffee, a new blade for the axe. The shopkeeper didn't speak much, but his eyes gave him away. When the man left, he heard the whisper before the door even shut. "Still got her out there," they say, sleeping in his bed. It wasn't true, but truth had never mattered much in places like this. Back at the cabin, she sat on the porch with her knees pulled up, the morning light warming her boots. She didn't ask what took so long. He didn't mention the looks. Inside, she unpacked the supplies while he unsaddled the mule. She held the flour like it weighed more than it did. People in town had started talking. She didn't need to be there to know it. It was always the same. Always had been. Folks feared what didn't fit cleanly inside their lines. That night, they ate in silence. Not the kind that choked, but the kind that held its breath. After, he lit a single candle and sat with his hands folded across his lap. She stared at the flame until her eyes burned. "Do they know what he did?" she asked finally. "No," he said. "Do they care?" He looked at her, then back to the flame. "They care about comfort, not cost." She leaned back against the wall, her shoulders lower than they'd been before. "Let them talk," she said. He didn't argue. Outside, wind stirred through the grass. The old fence groaned once, but didn't break. Inside, two people sat in the same room, saying nothing. But the silence had changed. It no longer kept them apart. The days didn't speed up. They just grew quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that didn't press anymore. The kind that made room. She started waking earlier, sometimes before the light broke. She didn't move much, just sat near the cold hearth with her arms folded over her knees, watching the walls catch the slow bloom of morning. One day he left a tin cup on the table like usual, but this time he added a pinch of sugar from the back shelf. Just a gesture. She didn't see him do it. When she sipped it, she didn't say anything, but she drank it all. He noticed because when he returned from mending a hinge on the back door, the cup was already clean. That afternoon, she swept the porch, not because it needed it, but because the motion steadied her hands. The boards were uneven, the nails pulled up just enough to catch cloth. Still, she swept slow, careful. She didn't want to fix anything. She just wanted to make something quiet feel cleaner than what sat inside her. He watched her through the barn slats. Not long, just enough to notice she wasn't looking at the ground anymore. The next evening, she wore the cloth he'd left on the table. It wasn't a proper dress, just an old shift with a collar. She'd reinforced herself. The stitching was uneven, but it held. He didn't mention it. She didn't expect him to. Instead, he filled her cup again that night without asking. Set it down near the hearth. Not too close. She nodded once. That was enough. He'd started carving again. Long, thin strips of wood shaved down into shapes with no purpose. His hands needed the rhythm. The room felt less empty when the shavings curled at his feet. She spoke while watching the fire. That horse, the one out back. You call her something? He nodded. Used to call her Mallow. Why? Color of her nose, pale like the flower. She didn't answer right away. I like it, she said finally. Don't think she minds, he said. That was all, but it was more than the day before. She started walking again. Not far, just along the fence line, boots soft against dry soil. She'd stop to touch the posts sometimes, like they might remember something she couldn't. The wind caught her braid and tugged loose strands across her cheek. She didn't tuck them away anymore. He saw her once from the window, arms stretched above her, spine arched to catch a bit of the sun. She didn't know he was watching. She hummed that night, just a few notes, barely a tune, but enough for him to look up from his book. She stopped as soon as she realized. I don't know why I did that. Maybe remembering something. Is remembering safe? No, he said, but it's real. She didn't hum again, but she didn't apologize either. In town, the talk hadn't quieted. The shopkeeper's wife said she'd seen the girl wearing one of his late wife's dresses, though he'd never said the shift was anyone's but hers. The preacher muttered about temptation. The old widow on the hill shook her head and said nothing, but sent a tin of dried herbs to the porch rail 2 days later. He didn't bring it inside. She did. That night he found the kettle steeping, and the house smelled faintly of mint and something sweeter underneath. He didn't ask what she'd used. She didn't say. But when she handed him a cup, he took it. They sat near the hearth again, not touching, not talking, just sitting in the same quiet that now felt shared. She reached down and pulled her boots off for the first time since arriving, set them neatly beside her, then leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. He watched the firelight catch the curve of her cheek and the line of her collarbone, where the stitching still held firm. He didn't smile, but he didn't look away. Later, when she rose and stepped into the back room to wash, she left her sack by the hearth, open. Not much inside, just fabric, a worn comb, a pocket knife, a folded bit of paper with ink, too faded to read. She returned with her hair damp and unbraided. She didn't ask for privacy. He didn't offer distance. They both just existed inside the same room, without apology. She paused near the window. Do you believe in redemption? She asked. I believe in keeping things alive, he said. She nodded slowly. Then maybe that's enough. The wind outside shifted. Not sharp, just cool and wide. The house held it out, but not completely. The air inside always carried a trace of what waited beyond the walls. But for the first time, neither of them braced against it. The hills turned dry again after 3 days of cloud without rain. Wind crept back in at night, slow and whispering, tugging at the corners of the house like it meant to test its weight. Clara stood at the fence line just after dawn, arms crossed, the borrowed dress pressed flat by the breeze. The light hadn't fully broken yet, but the sky had lost its softness. Something sharper lingered in the wind, familiar, bitter, and old. She didn't go far that morning, just walked the edge of the property, hands brushing the high grass, ears tuned more to silence than to sound. Ellis watched her from the porch steps, a tin cup resting on his knee. He'd noticed the change, too, though neither of them had spoken it aloud. By midday, the stillness thickened. Birds stayed low. The mule stomped more than usual. Even the boards under the porch seemed to creak differently. It was Clara who saw him first. She'd gone to the stream alone, the path winding through brittle sagebrush and dry stone. She knew it now, the bend in the trail, the dip before the flat, the place where the water whispered low and cold. She didn't kneel this time. She just stood there, letting the light filter through the trees, letting the quiet press into her chest. Then a shape, just beyond the bend, a rider. Still, too still, not moving, not pretending to move, just watching. Even from that distance, she knew the silhouette. Tall, broad, hat pulled low, hands resting too comfortably on the saddle horn. The cruel man hadn't forgotten, and he hadn't come to talk. Clara stepped back slowly. Her boots caught on a root, but she didn't fall. She turned and walked fast at first, then faster, until her breath caught, and her lungs felt scorched. Ellis was mending the corral gate when she returned. He looked up once and saw her face. That was enough. "He's here," she said, not out of fear, but certainty. Ellis dropped the hammer without sound, walked into the house. When he returned, the rifle was already loaded. "Where?" "Near the stream." He nodded once, mounted the mule, and rode out. Not toward town, not straight to the trail, but wide, circling, quiet, his boots steady in the stirrups, his shoulders squared like they were built for this kind of moment. Clara stood on the porch and watched until he disappeared into the trees. When he returned, the sun had tilted west. He said nothing, but the tension in his jaw had changed shape. That night, he bolted the front door for the first time since she arrived. Clara didn't ask what he saw. She didn't need to. Instead, she cleared the table after supper and wiped down the counter. Her fingers trembled once when the wind knocked against the shutters, but she didn't pause. Ellis sat near the hearth, sharpening the same blade he always used, though the edge didn't need it. He wasn't looking at her, but he was listening. "He's not just watching," she said finally. Ellis nodded. "He thinks I'll go back. That all of this," she waved toward the walls, the floor, the low fire, "is temporary." "He's wrong," Ellis said. She looked at him then, eyes sharp. "Is he?" Ellis met her gaze and didn't blink. "You're not his." "No," she said, "but he doesn't believe that." They sat in the hush that followed, firelight flickering against the stone. Later, Clara opened the guest room door again, stood in it longer than before. This time, she stepped inside, didn't lie down, just ran her hand along the quilt, fingers catching on the edge of old stitching. She left the knife on the nightstand. In town, the rumors hadn't cooled. The marshal had started asking quieter questions. The preacher's sermons hinted at lost souls and shame, though no names were spoken. That night, Clara stood in the yard under a sky thick with stars and ash. She held a lantern in one hand and stared toward the hills. Ellis joined her, arms folded, the rifle leaning against the porch post. "He won't stop," she said. "I know. You think he's waiting for night?" "No," Ellis said. "He's waiting for fear." She turned to him. "And if I'm done being afraid, then he's already lost." The wind carried the smell of smoke, not fire, but old smoke, carried far across miles of grass like a warning that hadn't quite burned out. They didn't sleep much, but neither of them kept watch alone. The wind shifted near dawn, not in strength, but in direction, blowing low and deliberate, pressing against the house like it meant something. Clara felt it before she heard the mules stir out back, before the dry crackle of wood snapped across the open plain. She sat up fast. No boots, just bare feet against the cold floor. The smell came next, sharp, bitter, crawling through the seams of the door like a warning too late to ignore. Ellis was already outside. The barn glowed at its edges, a slow orange pulse blooming up from underneath like the ground itself had caught fire. He was hauling water by the time she reached the steps, shirtless, breath ragged, eyes wild but focused. She didn't ask, didn't panic, just moved. Bucket. Well, water. Throw. Again. Again. The flames licked up the east wall, devouring slats and straw with teeth that didn't stop chewing. The mule thrashed inside, but Ellis got the gate open in time. Slapped the animal's side hard enough to send it bolting into the open dark. Clara kept pace. Her arms ached. Her lungs burned. Ash clung to her skin, her dress, her mouth. Still she ran. Still she carried. Ellis didn't speak. He pulled burning beams down with bare hands, doused them, kicked embers wide across the dirt to starve them. At one point, she stumbled near the edge of the fence, knees hitting hard. He reached her without hesitation, lifted her by the elbow, held on just long enough to steady her. That was all. Then back to the fire. Together, they worked past the point of sense. Smoke wrapped around them. Heat rose in waves. The sky above never blinked. By the time the flames gave up, the barn was half gone. Charred ribs of wood still smoked against the dawn, bent and blackened like the bones of something that hadn't known how to die properly. Ellis collapsed near the trough. His chest heaved. His palms were blistered. Sweat cut lines through the soot across his jaw. Clara stood over him, the bucket still in her hand. Her braid had unraveled. Her eyes were raw. The hem of her dress was scorched. "You think it was him?" she asked, voice low, like asking too loud might invite more. Ellis didn't answer right away. Then, "I don't think. I know." She sat beside him in the ash, pulled her knees to her chest, looked at the barn like it might speak if she stared long enough. "I thought fire was behind me," she said. Ellis didn't look at her, just pulled a cloth from his back pocket, wrapped it around his bleeding palm. "I thought men like him were behind me too," he said. "Turns out we were both wrong." Clara turned to him then, eyes sharp. "You want me gone?" "No." "You afraid I'll bring more of this?" "No," he said again, slower this time. "Then what are you afraid of?" He didn't answer. She studied his face, creased with smoke, sweat, and silence, and found nothing false there. "You could still walk away," Ellis said. She laughed once, but there was no humor in it. "If I run now, it'll be the last thing I do with my name." That landed. He looked at her then, really looked. And what he saw wasn't a girl on fire. It was a woman still standing in the smoke. He rose slowly, joints stiff, walked back to the house without waiting for her to follow. But he left the door open. Later, when the sun had cleared the ridge and the ash began to settle, Clara stepped inside. Her hands were shaking. Her feet were raw. She didn't go to the hearth this time. She went to the bed, not for sleep, not for comfort, for something else, something like defiance. She lay down with her arms folded over her chest and her eyes open to the ceiling. Across the room, Ellis sat in the chair near the door, the rifle across his lap. He didn't ask for the story behind her fire. She didn't ask for his. And neither of them moved until the day did. The next morning brought no apology from the sky, no soft rain to wash the ash, no forgiving wind, just flat gray light and silence that felt too still. Clara woke with her eyes already open. She hadn't slept much. Her body ached from the fire, but her spine stayed straight. She didn't move until the scent of coffee drifted in from the kitchen, thin but real. Ellis was already up, boots on, shirt buttoned, rifle leaned against the wall like a promise no one had spoken aloud. She stepped into the doorway and stood there for a moment, not waiting, just watching. "They'll come soon," she said. He nodded once. "I know." Neither asked how they knew. Some truths came quiet but certain. By midday, the mule paced the fence line, ears twitching. The wind pressed in from the hills. A bird took flight without cause. And then came the sound. Hooves on dry earth, slow, unhurried, like someone who already thought he'd won. Clara stepped onto the porch as the rider appeared around the bend. Same hat, same coat, same weight in the shoulders. Ezekiel Raddick hadn't changed. Ellis moved without rush, took the rifle, stood at the steps. His shadow stretched long in front of him. The rider stopped 10 paces from the porch. "Well," Ezekiel said, voice like iron dragged across gravel, "she's still here." Clara didn't flinch. "I gave you time," he went on. "Now I've come to collect." Ellis didn't speak. The rifle didn't shake. "She was never yours," he said finally. "She was bought. She was surviving." "She's a debt," Ezekiel snapped, "and you've been sheltering someone who doesn't know her place." Clara stepped forward then, bare feet on the porch boards, chin lifted. "I'm not a debt," she said. Ezekiel turned his gaze to her, mouth twisting. "You're a mistake." Ellis moved, just one step. "No," he said. "She's the reason I'm still alive." The silence after that was deep and sharp. Then Ezekiel's hand moved. Too fast. His pistol cleared leather with a flick of brass. But Ellis was faster. The shot cracked through the air. One round, clean, final. Ezekiel's body jerked once before hitting the dirt. Dust lifted, then settled. His pistol landed a few inches from his outstretched hand, untouched. Clara didn't move. Ellis lowered the rifle. No one breathed for a long moment. Then Clara stepped off the porch, walked to the body, looked down, not with pity, not with hate, just recognition. Like a chapter that had tried to rewrite itself was finally shut. Ellis followed, quiet behind her. "You all right?" he asked. "I've been worse." They stood together until the mule snorted behind them. An hour later, Marshal Boone rode up, coat dusty, expression unreadable. He looked from the body to Clara, then to Ellis. "What happened?" Clara stepped forward. "He didn't come for justice," she said. "He came for ownership, for taking." Boone studied her a moment longer. "Self-defense?" She shook her head. "No, not defense, an ending." Boone looked down at Ezekiel, then back at the two of them. "I didn't see anything." He turned his horse around and left without another word. That evening, the porch sat heavy with ash and dusk. The barn still smoked faintly at its edge. Inside, the table was cleared, the fire low but steady. Clara poured 2 cups, one for him, one for herself. They sat across from each other in the stillness that followed something final. "You never asked what I wanted," she said. Ellis didn't look up. "I figured if you stayed, that was answer enough." She set her cup down. "Ask me now." He did without words. She nodded once. That was all. There was no kiss. No confession. Just her hand sliding into his, quiet as a prayer. The world didn't cheer, but something inside them did. The morning after Ezekiel died, the sky didn't know what to do with itself. Light came slow, flat, gray like cooled ash. The kind of light that made everything seem softer from a distance, but didn't hide what had happened. Ellis rose early. Though he hadn't slept, he'd sat in the chair near the door all night, one boot tapping the floor, the rifle propped upright beside him, untouched since the shot. Clara stepped out from the back room with her arms wrapped around herself, braid half undone, the same scorched dress clinging in places it didn't belong. She moved slowly, carefully, not from fear anymore, but fatigue that had settled somewhere deeper than the bone. She didn't speak. She just walked outside barefoot, the porch boards warm under her feet from yesterday's sun. The wind was still, the fields unmoving, but the quiet no longer felt like a threat. Later that morning, she stood beside the small garden plot behind the house, the one that hadn't grown anything in years. The soil there was cracked, tired, but she knelt anyway, dug her fingers into the dirt without a spade, pulled rocks from beneath the surface and lined them along the edge. Ellis found her that way, elbows deep, hair falling over her face, hands stained. He crouched beside her and said nothing for a long while. "Too late in the season," he said finally. She nodded. "I know. Nothing will take root. Not this year," she said, "but maybe something will remember." He looked at her, really looked, past the grime and the bruises and the fire-scarred dress, past the guarded posture and the sharp tongue. What he saw was someone different from the girl he'd seen at the auction. Someone who had walked back into the smoke and come out carrying her own name. "You're not afraid of dying?" he asked. Clara shook her head. "I'm afraid of being erased." That night she hung the dress out on the line, not to dry, just to let it breathe. The wind tugged at it gently, lifting the hem as if remembering how to dance. Ellis sat on the porch oiling the rifle, but he wasn't looking at it. He was watching the horizon. She joined him, arms crossed, feet bare. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In town, news of what happened spread like any other story, slow and crooked, shaped by mouths too eager to carry someone else's ending. Some said the girl had seduced the widower and brought ruin to his land. Others claimed she was a curse, a witch, a broken thing that came with fire in her wake. No one came to check the truth, but someone left a jar of honey on the porch rail 2 days later. Another left a folded blanket, freshly laundered, a quiet apology wrapped in usefulness. Neither of them said thank you, but they used both. Clara began mending the curtains that had hung limp in the kitchen since before she arrived. Then the ones in the front room. She stitched by the window, fingers working in rhythm with the breeze. Each time she paused, she listened for something. Not danger, just proof that the quiet was still holding. Ellis kept fixing the barn, one beam at a time. It stood lopsided, but it stood. That was enough. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it was honest. One morning, she brought him a tin cup of coffee with a slice of bread folded beneath it. He looked at her, and she just said, "Eat it while it's warm." That was the first time he smiled. Not much, just the edge of it. But it was real. Later that week, she asked to ride the mule. Said she wanted to see how far the fence line ran. He watched her from the porch as she mounted alone, adjusting the reins like she'd done it 1,000 times. She didn't ride fast, just steady along the ridge, the wind pushing her braid over her shoulder. When she returned, dusk had settled low. The mule was calm, her face unreadable. He opened the gate for her without asking. That night they sat at the table across from one another with the firelight dancing low between them. "You still want me to stay?" she asked. Ellis looked up from his hands. "I never asked." "I know," she said, "but I want to hear it." "You're not mine," he said. "Not to ask, not to keep. But if you stay, then we make it yours too." Clara stared into her cup for a long time, then nodded once. She rose and walked to the back room, not with fear, not to hide, but to sleep. She left the door open behind her. That night, Ellis didn't sit by the fire. He walked into the same room, set his boots beside hers, and lay down without a word. Outside, the wind softened. The sky held no fire. The land had burned, but something still stood. Not just a house, not just a man and a woman, but something stitched together from quiet and chosen without being asked.